Picking up where we left off last, we've got our pieces of the blaster ready to clean to get primed. I'm just using some standard rubbing alcohol along with a microfiber cloth to make sure that there's no little bits of dirt or fabric left behind that are going to show up on the piece after we apply the primer. I'm just putting the alcohol on the rag and then rubbing it a little bit so it spreads around, and then I'm going to put my pieces onto the rag, making sure that I get into all the little bits, and thankfully alcohol evaporates really quick, so it's almost dry instantly with just a quick rub. This contraption that you see in the background is my spray booth. It helps extract all of the nasty particulates and the toxins that come off spray paint and also airbrush paint too, and I've just got it exhausting out of a window. With all of our pieces done, we can now get our primer ready. I'm using Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in light grey. I find that it works perfect for plastics. I use it on models, so it's going to be fine on this too. To get it ready, I need to give it a vigorous shake for about 30 seconds just to make sure all the paint's nice and mixed up. I want to apply a very thin and even coat on all of the pieces. You may be wondering what the yellow glove is for. I wonder that sometimes too. It's just to stop the paint from going on my hand. And if you're wondering why I'm applying primer to fix a seam line, the reason is that primer really helps to highlight any imperfections in the piece, so the seam lines are going to stand out more, and also if there's issues with other mould lines, I'll be able to see them a lot easier this way. The camera refuses to focus, so use your imagination in assuming that that piece was done perfectly. And here we're going for the handle. I'm spraying it from a variety of different angles, and that's just to ensure that I get the most coverage and I don't miss any little spots, any little grooves, and any little mould details that might be there in the piece. It's a good idea to remember that you can always put more paint on. Now you can take paint off, but it's very time consuming and very boring. So make sure you go nice and light and even, and if after inspection you feel like you need to put an extra coat down or you need to get in to do some of those finer details, go right ahead. Make sure that you shake in between your pieces and always check the nozzle to make sure that it's not clogged up. If it is, you can use a cotton bud or Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol or paint thinner on it just to rub the little hole clean, give it a test spray, and if the clog's gone, carry on. One area that I need to be sure not to miss is the inside of the piece, and the reason is that when I'm putting it back together, there's going to be a seam line I need to fix, and I'm not sure how much material I'm going to take off the top layer. That could expose some of the inside panels, so as long as they're painted too, I shouldn't have any issues. Now and again you may feel the urge just to really hammer down on the nozzle, but I have to advise against it. You've got to go slow, you've got to go even, you've got to go steady, and you've got to go from all angles. The worst thing you can do is hold the spray can in one place and push the nozzle down, because what that's going to do is spiderweb your paint, or even worse, it's going to make it run, and if it runs, it's going to dry, and if it dries, it's going to be a pain to clean up. And with that, we are done. Just going to leave the pieces here to dry. The can says 20 minutes touch dry, but I'm going to leave them for a couple of hours. Got all my tools ready here. Just some Tamiya sanding sponges in 600 grit. 1000 grit, 2000 grit and 3000 grit. I'm going to be working my way from coarse to fine to make sure I get a nice even finish, and this extra thin cement dries super fast, so that's what we're going to be using to fill in the gap in the seam line. Now I just want to put my parts back in, so I'm looking for the peg, there it is, and because we've applied the primer, it might seem a bit stiffer in the joints, and that's perfectly normal. And again, because it's primer, we don't really have to be worried about the paint chipping. Just as a rule of thumb, it's better off to be more gentle than harsh, as we learnt from the death of our good screwdriver earlier on. Putting these pieces together is pretty simple, remembering that they will go together tighter once we put the screws in. But what I want to do here is make sure the parts are touching as much as possible, so that when I run the super thin cement down the seam line, the capillary action will just fill in all of the gaps without me doing too much work. With the primer on and the piece put back together, we can now get a good idea of how bad that seam line is. Looking at it, it seems to be running up the whole piece, but it stands out more on that little circular nub sticking out from the last quarter of the rifle, also the barrel, and a little bit at the tip there. Give the cement a shake just in case there's any hard bits in there. Rub off the edge in the bottle and apply liberally. And I can see already that it's getting right into that seam line, filling it up. I'm going to need to use quite a bit of this. The benefits of using a thin cement is because it dries quicker and it's finer and can get into grooves. If you're using a thicker cement, then you'll need to apply it on the parts before you stick the parts together. You'll notice that I'm going over the same area multiple times, and that's because of the thinness of the cement. It's going to take a lot more than just one coat to get in there and fill in the gaps. I think that's good enough for me, to be honest. We've filled in most of the gap. Now that it feels like one solid piece, we can get ready to sand off the areas and hopefully get rid of those seam lines now that they've been filled in. And the reason we're using sanding sponges as opposed to just sandpaper or sanding sticks is that the sponges have got a lot of give in them, so when you're pushing down on rounded surfaces, the sponge conforms to the shape of the piece, and that way you're going to get an even finish without altering any of the cylindrical features of the barrel. With a sanding stick, you can only sand in a straight line, so it's going to completely flatten out any curves that you've got in the piece that you're customizing. time for a quick review. Let's see where we are. So we've only been working with the 600 grit paper at the moment, and we can see that there are some improvements, especially there on the top of the barrel. The piece is starting to come together, but more towards this middle section we can see that that seam line is still quite prevalent. Fear not though, with the power of perseverance and a desire to make Magnus into a man, I've carried on, I've gone through my various grits. You can see I've pretty much taken all of the primer off from the places that I've been sanding, and our seam lines are no more. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll get to painting this blaster in the next episode.